So thank you for the introduction. So I want to thank Tracy B at the Themester 2020 program because as you might know, the topic for this semester is democracy. And Themester 2020 gave us an unusual opportunity for Professor Muzz and I to collaborate. So we're teaching a new class on math and politics, and some of the things you're going to hear from us today have something to do with that class. So I'm going to get it started for roughly about 15-20 minutes, and then Professor Maz will continue, and together we're going to talk to you about how math and politics can intersect and combine in very productive ways. And I think this is an excellent example of the liberal arts and sciences combined approach that the college promotes. So as you know, the mission of the college entails different principles. The ones that are going to be particularly pertinent to our talk are going to be the two that ask us to ask critical questions, and especially the one about thinking logically. So I'm going to share my screen with you, and I'm going to talk to you about fair elections, and I'll give you an introduction to today's conversation. Okay, so first, our primary focus will be on representative democracies. First and foremost, because this is the most common type of democracy we see across the world. What you see here is a picture of the Indiana State House in downtown Indianapolis, and it represents this type of political democracy where citizens elect public officials who then make decisions on our collective behalf. This is not the only type of democracy you can have. Here's a picture of a New England town hall meeting where ordinary citizens get together and they actually shape local decisions. So this will be an example of a direct democracy. So we have these two big models of democracy, direct and representative. So today we'll talk about democracy. You're going to hear a lot about that, but that's not all. Because as it turns out, although we'll emphasize voting in elections, the things we're going to talk about actually apply to any type of group environment, any type of society. So many of you think about your own professional experience. I'm sure you have been or are part of groups that you do lots of things, and besides having lots of meetings, perhaps you also need to make lots of decisions. So if any of you are part of a group that needs to make decisions, then there are general lessons for you to learn that transcend politics and public affairs. So, and I say this because it also helps to situate our talk, although it focuses on math and politics, within the broader intellectual landscape. So since we're talking about group choices, there are clear connections to be made between our topic and decision theory, broadly construed, economics. So if you think about connections to other behavioral sciences, and although we're not going to talk about philosophy, the notion of fairness is a normative concept that invites philosophical reflection. So we're not going to do that, but our own approach, for those of you who might be familiar with philosophy, will be more aligned with the branch of philosophy known as analytic philosophy. So again, what I'm trying to do here is draw connections to the liberal arts. So this is a class on math and politics, but it's also a class on the liberal arts and sciences. So I initially thought that given the fact that this is a food for thought series, that I should give you an appetizer. But then I reconsider, and I thought, well, it's almost dinner time. So why not give people the main dish right away? But then I reconsidered, I thought maybe I should give you just a little bit. So that's what I'm about to do. So I'm gonna give you a 1-minute summary of our talk. And I do so with two purposes in mind. One, to convey the general lessons we can draw from a combined approach, one that combines mathematics and politics, but also because these are themes that are going to come up again during the course of our talk. So first, the first thing we want to say is that we're not going to offer a universal definition of fairness. What we're going to say instead is that different societies, so across different places will have different notions of fairness. Similarly, the same group of people they're thinking about fairness can evolve over time. So that means the particular meaning of fairness is gonna be contingent on the particular setting. Now, I'm not saying that fairness is a subjective concept that is purely a matter of personal opinion. What I'm saying is that the context matters, and so that's what I'm saying. It purely is a descriptive fact, but also this is the first opportunity for math to really shine in terms of being able to move forward. So if we realize, we establish that in fact people have different notions of fairness, what math can do is offer precise definitions of fairness that we can then subject to logical and mathematical analysis. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of how fairness varies across places and societies. And then one of the big lessons that emerges out of this mathematical approach is that there's no universal, if you think about voting rules, voting systems in general, there's no perfect system. So every system you can possibly devise to make group choices is going to have some advantages and disadvantages. And the big lesson that's going to come out of this talk, one of the points we want to make is groups can't have it all, but this type of logical analysis produces knowledge that we can use to make judicious choices about trade-offs we can make between different properties. So one of these properties might be fairness, but there are others that might matter to us as well. Like you want to have elections that are effective, that they actually produce choices. You might want to have prefer simpler to more complicated elections. There are sorts of things we want, properties we appreciate in elections, and we can't have all of them at once. But with this type of approach, we'll have a better understanding of the choices we can make. Now, to be clear, so the title of the talk is "What is the fair election and what does math have to do with it?" We're not here to talk about a particular election, whether a particular outcome is fair or not. Math would certainly be useful. It's useful to do the required calculations of any election, starting with the basic operation of counting votes. But the utility of mathematics, and indeed the sort of the power of mathematics, really shines in its ability to make more general statements, not about a particular election, but voting systems. So another way to put this, to make this point, is to say that what mathematics can do is analyze the general implications of voting systems for all possible elections, those that we have already observed, those we might be currently doing, and any future election that might come our way. So that's really the power of mathematical analysis. And another thing that circles back to democracy is, I think all of us can agree with the common notion that democracy entails a political regime that elicits the will of the people, that is responsive to the will of the people. But as it turns out, even if you have the same group of people with the same preferences, there's more than one way to elicit. There's more than one will of the people. And that's, so we're going to revisit this point various occasions during the talk. So here's the summary. Let me talk a little bit about how fairness depends on place and time. So the first example I'm going to give you is a simple example where I'm going to ask you to consider entertain a simple society with 1,000 people. And for simplicity, let's assume that all 1,000 people can vote in an election, and they have an election. So here where you see, you have a table with 3 columns. The first column identifies the party. So we have 5 parties that are competing in this election. And the second column will show you the number of people in the population. So there are 1,000 people. So the first row here, for example, tells you that 28 people support party A. And then the third column gives you a number between 0 and 1, a fraction of people who support one or another party. So this is the raw information I'm going to use. And what I'm going to show you next are 2 voting systems that elicit the will of the people. The first one that we're all very familiar with are presidential systems that use this winner-take-all principle approach to elections. And if we're to use that principle, it requires a very simple calculation. You just look at the percentages and you find the largest one, in this case, party E, wins the election. Notably, here we have a lot of competition, insofar as we have 5 parties as opposed to 2 or 3. And the party that wins does so without a majority. So already you get a glimpse of the trade-offs that might arise in the process of implementing one voting system over another. So this is a very simple approach, but we might be concerned, you might be concerned, that the winning candidate, the winning party, does not command the majority. Now, this is not the only way to run an election. Parliamentary democracies use another principle, the principle of proportional representation. And the guiding idea here is that you count the votes, you calculate the proportion of support for the different parties, and you accommodate the parties. So let's assume here that there are no thresholds. So anyone who gets a positive vote, at least one vote, gets to be part of the of government. So suppose you had 65 seats, simple legislature with 65 seats. That's the way parliamentary democracies work. They actually anchor around the legislature. So in contrast to presidential democracies, the separate powers, and the parliamentary democracy, the legislative and executive powers are actually integrated. So those details aside, here's an example of a fair allocation of seats that takes into account the respective support for the different parties. So we will give, if we have 65 seats, we will give 2 seats to party A, 7 seats to party B, and so on. Now, there's one apparent advantage of the system, which is to say that all the parties, which is to say all the people who support these parties, get some type of representation. But there are other trade-offs as well. Now, this is not a talk about comparisons between parliamentary and presidential democracies. So I'm not going to talk about all the different complications that might arise. But this is just what I want to show you here is that fairness, these are fair, legitimate ways of listening to the will of the people. And depending on which rule you use, you get different answers, different ways of doing it. Now, fairness also depends on time. So here, in the next few minutes, I want to show you a very brief political history of apportionment in the US. Apportionment is the decision that the government needs to make every 10 years. So after we have a census, we need to allocate 435 congressional seats. And what you see here is a diagram that traces the political history in terms of the different methods that we have used to determine these numbers. The first method corresponds to Jefferson's method, starting in 1792. This is 2 years after the first census. Notably, Jefferson's method hasn't been continuously used since the late 1700s. You see a succession of 5 different methods. Now, if you look at the political history, you might just think, well, this is just a matter of people coming out with better ideas and so on. But the history of apportionment in the US is intimately related to fairness. And this is the reason why I wanted to talk to you about it. What we don't see in this timeline is the fact that in the initial years of the Republic, there were actually competing proposals about how to solve this problem. The 2 major competing proposals were championed by Jefferson and Hamilton. Jefferson, as you might remember, was the first Secretary of State. Hamilton was the first Secretary of the Treasury. So this was a political fight within the first cabinet. And Hamilton's proposal actually made it to the desk of President Washington, who vetoed the proposal. So Jefferson wins the day. And Jefferson's method is going to be used for the next 50 years. But there are concerns about the fairness of the method. So almost right away, you get another, there's not called a political fight, but another political debate between prominent members, prominent politicians at the time. So some people argue, Adams argues that Jefferson's method is not fair to smaller states. So there's something about the method, the way you allocate seats, that introduces a systematic bias against smaller states. So no surprise, Adams is going to propose a competing proposal that actually favors small states at the expense of larger states. So they're not going to resolve that issue, and instead what we get is a compromise. So Daniel Webster is going to come out with a proposal that it's a compromise between the Jefferson and the Adams method, and that's going to last for roughly about 40 years. And then Hamilton's method is going to make a comeback. Now, as you know, Hamilton died fairly early, so Hamilton is not alive by the time they actually implement his method, but it's going to last for roughly about the latter half of the 19th century. And then towards the end of the 19th century, there's a lot of debate about whether this is a good method, and it eventually gets replaced. They bring back the previous one, that's Webster's method. So all these are, so of course I can't do justice to the political history, but what I'm trying to convey here is that you have a society evolving over time whose notion of fairness is evolving over time. And the actual methods that get implemented are a result of not just political debate, but also political compromise. So these are all prominent politicians. And then in the early part of the 20th century, we get a new method proposed by, combines proposals from Hill, who's actually a statistician for the government, and Huntington, who's a math professor at Harvard. So this is really the first academic proposal that we get. And this is the method we use right now. So let me show you how they work very quickly. I'm not going to attempt to do this for the US because we have hundreds of millions of people and we have 435 seats to allocate. So I'm going to show you a quick example of Hamilton method works. And I'm going to use that to elicit how mathematical analysis comes into the picture. So I'm going to recycle my society of 1,000 people, but instead of measuring political support, I'm going to measure the distribution of the population. So the second column is still population across 5 different states. So the letters A, B, C, D, and E now represent states. And the way apportionment will work is the first thing you do is you calculate an ideal apportionment or quota. And the way to do this is to, so you divide 20 divided by 1,000 will give you the share that I presented earlier. You multiply that share times 65 and you get a number like 1.820. So the ideal number of seats for state A is 1.820. And I'm emphasizing the decimal points because this is the crux of the apportionment problem. These fractional numbers are going to be where all the debate about fairness arises. So the way Hamilton does this is to, well, before we get to Hamilton's method, we're going to introduce mathematical analysis here. I'm not going to show you the technical definitions, but instead what I'm going to present to you is more of a general description of the types of properties, the types of questions that a mathematician, a mathematical approach brings to the issue here. So one way to think about fairness is to think about things that wouldn't look fair to us. And there are 3 properties I'm going to show you here. One, and I'm going to give you particular outcomes, but the thrust of this analysis is that we're trying to verify these types of outcomes, not just for a particular election, for all possible elections. So look at this outcome where state B gets 7 seats. That doesn't seem that unreasonable. After all, their ideal number is 7.995. But state C, which has more people, gets 6 seats. So it doesn't look fair. It doesn't look fair because the largest state is getting fewer seats. So we don't want to see that happen. Another thing we wouldn't want to see is given extreme allocations to states. So going back to state B, so if the ideal number is 7.9, which is very close to 8, given state B 6 seats, seems like a major deviation. Doesn't seem fair. Similarly, if you gave state B 9 seats, they're not going to complain, but that's going to come at the expense of another state. After all, we have a finite number of seats. So we don't want that. We don't want to see that outcome either. And these 2 are static conditions. So for any particular apportionment, we can verify whether these conditions are violated, whether we see these unfair outcomes. But there's another one that is particularly important, especially important for the political history of the US in the 19th century, because this was a dynamic society, growing society, expanding both in terms of population and territory. And there's something that, so you might be concerned about fairness over time. And one of the things that can happen, actually, you can show that it's mathematically possible to have, over time, to have a state grow in size, so it's a larger state, and lose seats at the same time that another state shrinks and gains seats. Now, that seems kind of counterintuitive if you think about it. A state that has more people gets fewer seats. Another state has fewer people, they get more seats. We call that a population paradox. So I'm going to give short names to these conditions, M, Q, and P, and show you how Hamilton's method works, and then I'm going to turn it over to Professor Mas. So Hamilton's method starts by, actually requires 2 rounds. So the first round is not controversial at all. So you look at the whole numbers. So for state A, the number so is 1.820. So we'll give 1 seat to state A. For state B, we'll give 7 and so on. And when you do that initial round, you have allocated 61 seats. So there are 4 to spare. And that's where the question, and again, that's where the controversy arises. So how do you do that? Hamilton proposed that you look at these fractional numbers along the decimal point, and you start with the largest and work your way down. So we have 4 seats to allocate. So we look at the fractional numbers, and state B happens to have the largest fractional number, 995. So we're gonna change the 7 to an 8. And when you do the calculations, then the adjusted numbers are gonna look like this, and they add up to 65. So you're done. Now, you might ask yourselves, is this a fair method? Well, we wouldn't just look at the numbers. We would look at the properties. And it can be proven that Hamilton's method is going to pass the M condition. So it's not going to give us the unfair outcome where smaller states get more seats. It's not going to give extreme apportionments to states, but it's going to fail the population property. So if you think about the context where you have major population changes, and not just overall population changes, but redistribution among the different states, Hamilton's method is not going to work. It's gonna produce outcomes that are not just counterintuitive, but unfair. So now there's a way, if you really care about condition P, if you're in a situation where your population is changing and you need to make sure that over time the method is not unfair, then there are methods like Jefferson's method, known as divisor methods, that can guarantee that you actually satisfy P. Now you might think, I don't have time to show you, but you might think, well, if these divisor methods satisfy P, then we're done. We've found the ultimate apportionment method. But the answer to that question is, well, first of all, not so quick. If we were to, so we can analyze, we can use mathematical analysis to ascertain the possibility that any particular apportionment method, or in fact, any type of foreseeable method you could devise to figure out this problem, would it be able to satisfy these 3 properties? And the answer to that question is no. We can prove, there are theorems that can prove this, that it is impossible for any method, either the ones that have already been created or any other method you might possibly create in the future, to satisfy all 3 conditions all the time. So that means at best, you can satisfy 2 of the 3 conditions. And that invites reflection on the corresponding society to figure out which of these notions of fairness are going to be most important or most relevant to your current political situation. So I'm going to turn things over to Professor Maz, but he's going to talk to you about voting systems. And this is going to speak to the last point I made initially about how from the same group of people, we can elicit different wills, different ways to figure out what people want. Thank you.
Okay, so I think I need to share the screen here. Yeah, I think, so everybody can hear me, right? I thought it would be fun to start out by, or to continue on, by actually having an election. So we had the appetizer and the main course, and now it's time for dessert, and we will have an election for the first national ice cream flavor. So if you're going to have an election, you should have some candidates, and we have 3 candidates: butter pecan, Oreo, and ube. Now, like in any situation where you have an election, you should start out by finding something out about the candidates. You should find out like what they're like. You might want to find out where they're from. You might want to attend a debate between them, do something like that. But after a while, you think about your 3 candidates, and you have to decide what to vote for. And I would like to conduct an election with you by having an election like this. So you have to put the 3 candidates, butter pecan, Oreo, and ube, into some order. And there's 6 possible orders that you could put them in. This one, the top choice being butter pecan, then Oreo, and then ube, or you have any of these other 6. And I believe that Vanessa is going to actually allow us to conduct an election here between these 6 profiles. So yes, you can everybody should pick one and do a quick poll like this, right? And then while I'm continuing on, I think Professor Razo will conduct the election in the ways that I will show you. And so I'll give you like another few seconds to do this. And then we'll actually see what happens here in this election. Okay, I think we're probably done with this poll here. So I hope everybody has voted, because we definitely depend on your results. Okay, so here's the results. So I'm going to close this from my my screen here. This is how it happened, how it turned out here. Okay, so okay, so let me actually say this about voting theory. So this was already mentioned by Armando. So voting theory is actually not about particular elections. It actually is about voting systems. So that's a little bit of a different kind of flavor than you might have expected. So I'm not going to have anything to say about whether a particular election was fair or not fair, or done in a good way or a bad way. But we're going to actually talk about systems of voting. And it turns out that there's more than one way to vote. In fact, there's many ways to vote, and I'm going to show you 3 of them. So I'm going to do a kind of fake election here where there are 5 candidates called A, B, C, D, E. So these are just five candidates and 7 voters. So the voters are V1 to V7. These are the ones here. And just like with the ice cream, I've asked all of the voters to put their candidates in order, with the top being at the top and the bottom choice, the lowest choice being at the bottom. And each voter handed me their preferences in a certain order. And so, you know, this is how the election turned out. Now, the first kind of way of voting that I want to mention is plurality voting. So plurality voting is how we usually do it in American elections. So everybody has a list of their choices in order, but in fact, they only vote their top choice. We don't care about your second place or third place, anything. We just care about your top choice. And you make your top choice, and then we do is we take whoever has the most of the top choices. And in that case, A would win the election, because A has 3, C has 2, B has 1, and E has 1. Okay. So with this way of doing things, A would win. Now, there's even a little bit of a wrinkle, because in some states, or even some cities in America, you have what's called plurality voting with a runoff if nobody gets more than 50%. So in this case, nobody got more than 50%, because 3 out of 7 is less than 50%. And then you'd have to have some kind of runoff, which in effect makes for a different voting system. The second voting system is called the Borda count. So this is a picture of Jean-Charles de Borda, and he was actually a French scientist, and he lived actually around the same time as Jefferson and Hamilton. So he lived through the American Revolution, and his voting system comes from that time. So before then, I mean, it's interesting history, nobody really thought of the question, how do we make an election? Because nobody had an election. So all this stuff comes from the American Revolution and the French Revolution. So Borda said, what you should do in the case of 5 candidates is everybody has a certain number of points that they hand out. And you would hand out 4 points to your top choice, 3 points to your second choice, 2 points to your third choice, 1 point to your fourth choice, and nothing for your last choice. And everybody would do that. And that means they would kind of tip the thing towards the one that they liked the most. But you'd still count for your second choice a little bit more and stuff like that. And then you would add things up. So in this case, like candidate A would get 4 points from this one, 4 from this one, 4 from this one, nothing, from this one, 1, from this one, 1, and from this one, nothing. So we total 4, 4, 4, 1, so 0, 1, 1, and 0, and we would get 14. So then we would calculate it for everybody else, and we would see that actually B, candidate B would in this case win the Borda count. So if the election were held Borda's way, B would be the winner. Now there's one last one that I'm going to mention called the Hare system, which is the most complicated one. But in fact, it's actually used in places maybe more than the Borda count. So what we do is we look at everybody's top choice here. And we see that actually D was not mentioned as anybody's top choice. So let's decide that we really don't like D at all. We're just going to throw D out. In fact, we're going to delete D from everybody's ballot. We're going to like refigure everybody's ballot to not include D. So now everybody only has 4 choices. And the way we do this is like, for example, voter number 4, we kept C and B as the first 2, and then we forgot about D, and then we have E and A. And then now we look at this thing. So here's our vote now, and we look at what's happening here. We have 3 for A, 2 for C, and then 1 for B and 1 for E. And we say, well, B and E, only one person liked each of them. That's the lowest of the high ones of the first choice. So let's delete B and E. And we do that again, and here's what we get. We get 3 for A, and now C has 4 choices, four ballots. So we would actually declare C the winner this way. So if we did it this way, C would be the winner using the Hare system. So we had 3 voting systems. So we had plurality voting, and then Borda, and then the Hare system. And if we do it for the same election, we'd see that A wins for plurality voting, B wins for the Borda count, and C wins for the Hare system. So who wins the election depends actually on what method you're doing to run the election. So at this point, I think it's probably good to go back to the ice cream, so and see which one you guys liked, which way. So are the results ready for this?
They are.
Okay, let's see it.
So let me share my screen quickly. So for all methods, batter pecan wins.
Okay, so yeah, you could see here that, okay, plurality had won, so it was the highest plurality. It wasn't more than half, but it was the highest plurality. For the Borda count, it was the clear winner. And the Hare system, I guess it turned out that butter pecan won also. So it actually could happen that like we saw with the election that I ran, different combinations win and stuff like that. So I will go back and finish up what I have to say here. Let's go back to this. Okay, so I want to ask the question just at the end whether math or political science could help to see which is the fairest way to do an election. So one thing that I thought of doing and just didn't think we would have time to do would be to actually have an election about elections. So I would ask your opinion as to whether you think plurality voting, the one we usually do, is more fair than the Borda count or more fair than the Hare system. I was going to actually do this, but then I realized that if I was going to have this kind of an election, I would have to decide what kind of an election to hold for it. And then it wasn't clear how to do this, because it would all be a kind of election about elections, and I wouldn't know what to do. So, but to go back to this question about math or political science and fairness, there are ways in which it does and ways which it doesn't. So it's actually it's fair to say no, and it's fair to say yes. So the no answer is that neither the math or the political science is really about the question of fairness head on. And if you're in science, if you're not looking for an answer, you're probably not going to find it. So all the mathematical theory is not exactly addressing the question of what fairness is. It's more addressing the question of, if you think fairness is X, Y, and Z, then which procedures are fair and which are fairer than other ones. But this X, Y, and Z that you put down as fairness is something that's really for the philosopher or political philosopher to help us with, and not for anybody else. On the other hand, there is a yes part of the answer, because once the mathematicians and the political scientists start talking to each other, they come up with conditions for fairness, like the ones for apportionment that we saw a few minutes ago, that actually are interesting, and they might be interesting conditions to think about when you're thinking about fairness. And when you study those, you kind of think about the trade-offs between voting systems, between apportionment systems, between systems for dividing things up. Our whole class is about various kind of problems that all are, in a sense, impossible to do perfectly, but possible to do partially. And the political science suggests the questions, and the math suggests the answers. So I think that's probably a good place for us to end this part of our presentation, and we're happy to chat with all of you.
Okay, well, in that case, I guess I will enter the conversation. Thank you so much to Drs. Moss and Razo. I learned a lot listening to the presentation, and we got some great questions from the audience as well. One place where I'd like to start deals with a question that John asked, and it's a really good question because it speaks to the suggestion that Dr. Moss gave at the end of his remarks that all of these decisions about which voting system to use assume some pre-agreement that we should have democracy in the first place. So John asks, wouldn't parties in a rational universe favor systems that ensure their hold on power regardless of how fair they are? And I thought that that question was really interesting. It also dovetailed with the comment that Stephen gave about whether the concerns of socially and economically marginalized groups have anything to say about this conversation too. Is there some degree to which the conversation that we're having about which voting system is most appropriate presupposes that that conversation is important in the first place?
Well, let me offer a few comments and then Professor Moss can jump in. So John is right that there needs to be some type of common ground to begin with. What I would say is that common ground doesn't solve the whole problem. So to go back to the example I gave, if you think about, especially the early political history of the US, the conflict between smaller and bigger states is going to be a recurring theme, right? But there was common ground. There was once we made the transition from the first to the Second Continental Congress, we moved away from the Confederation. That we have an understanding that states should be represented, but then the big question is how. So yes, on the one hand, there needs to be some consensus, but then you get into the complications that people might disagree, and they might disagree for the reasons that John suggests. Rational participants, people can foresee the consequences. Let's assume that they can do so. And they might be reluctant to adopt a rule that is going to empower other parties at their expense. So, and that generates a lot of the political debate. So Stephen's question about how the role of other participants is very important because, so we didn't have this. Professor Miles entertained the idea of having an election about elections, but that opportunity arises, it doesn't arise very frequently, but it's also an opportunity for the participants to implement something that is going to give a lot of power and is going to be very hard to reverse. So if you're in that position, you have certain privileges that future generations are not going to be able to access. And we didn't talk about this, but there are general results in this line of thinking that also say that I already told you that there's no perfect system. There's another general result, a theorem, that says that any type of system you can imagine, those we have seen and need to be invented, are vulnerable to manipulation. So people can learn to game the system. So to put the two together, Johnson Stevens' comments, it's going to be very difficult. First of all, the people who get to make these initial choices are going to be able to exercise a lot of power. And the people who come later, whether it be future generations or marginalized communities, it's going to be very difficult for them to change the initial rules.
I mean, I have a different line of thinking about both of those questions, but I don't know if you want me to answer it or if you wanted to go on to a different question.
Oh, no, please go ahead.
Okay, so let me make just a few comments. So this is partly the same as Armando and partly different. So I think the question about what parties will want and something like that, these are all very strategic concerns and things like that. So that means you're not just doing a one-shot voting. You're doing voting, and then you're talking about the future voting, and there's a whole history, and then there's what's going to happen next and things like that. Once you do that in a mathematical model, you have made things much more interesting and much more complicated. What we have told you about, what I showed you with an election, was the one-shot kind of election that doesn't have any strategic behavior, and nothing changes and nothing happens, and people don't persist over time and something like that. So I've given you only the most basic kind of model. And when you're doing mathematical models, I mean, you start with something very simple. And once you start adding more and more realistic kinds of things, they become very hard and also much more applicable and interesting, but they're harder to study and there's less to say about them. That's one thing. Now, the way I read Stephen's question was about, he asked, was there any advice from us, from us to people who were, let me see exactly how it goes. Do you have any advice?
Oh, the particular question was phrased, what advice do you have to sustain the intersectional movement towards social and economic justice for our most marginalized communities?
Right. So, this is this is a very hard thing to ask. So the actual truth is that there's nothing in what I'm teaching or today or in our class that actually could address that directly. I have opinions about it. And the class that I'm teaching has a suggestion about it. But again, these really depend a lot on, for example, the numbers involved. And they depend a lot on the hard data. And they're not something that I feel comfortable answering as a professor. I mean, I feel like I have an opinion about this as a voter, and a citizen and stuff like that. But I don't feel like anything that I'm telling you about clearly points to an answer for any kind of strategic thing by any group of people. Sorry to say.
Well, so that's an unsettling logic, but it certainly does speak to the topic at hand. On the topic, however, of citizens' own preferences about which voting system would be fair or not fair. In preparation for this panel, I was reviewing some of the literature on the early movements for direct democratic reforms in the US states. And in their recent book, Democracy for Realists, Chris Aiken and Larry Bartels discuss how when citizens in various states were given the option of instituting more direct democratic reforms, a lot of them simply turned in their ballots blank on that question, as if to say that when you let people make a decision about what kind of voting system they would like to have, sometimes they just either feel overwhelmed or feel ill-equipped to make a judgment. Does the fact that citizens have trouble, and this is borne out in the recent literature too, does the fact that they have trouble determining which voting systems to support themselves, is that a byproduct of the inherent difficulty here that you've described? Or are there some systemic inequalities that might account for people not quite knowing which voting system would be better for them?
I think people are just not used to this idea that there are different systems, and they are not used to the idea that they would have to put let's say, a ranked list of every possible candidate in all the orders. And they might feel that somebody's trying to cheat them, or that it's a deviation from history, and therefore it's somebody's trying to get something on them. I don't know the actual answer why people didn't do that. But it's also a hard decision to make. I mean, if you ask people, would they vote for the US Constitution today, or various amendments to it, they might turn that in blank also,
Yeah, it's just, Professor Razo, did you have anything to add on that point?
Well, I think I do. And I think it's also common that circles back to Stephen's question. So yes, on the one hand, it might be difficult to operate in this kind of environment. And again, like Professor Maz, I'm not making any suggestions, but I think the type of analysis we presented does, again, it recalls this general lesson that you can make improvements, you can make marginal improvements. So one way to empower communities or individuals whose interests are perceived not to be represented in the system is to try a different rule. But then you run into trade-offs. So you saw a few examples of just a few rules. There are literally hundreds of different voting rules we could use. But arguably, there are rules where they're listed a lot more information from voters that might translate into either enhanced representation or a greater ability to shape outcomes. So you could, if you entertain the idea, well, what can I do to promote my interests or the interests of a particular subpopulation? Well, you might consider a different voting procedure, but there's a trade-off, and the trade-off is, and the particular example, general example I'm providing here is that you also deal with a more complicated procedure, and you run into all sorts of complications. For one, there's a problem of public perception. Do I trust the new system because it's unfamiliar? But there are also, to your point, Eric, I think there will also be concerns about what do we require from voters to operate efficiently under a more complicated procedure. And maybe for a variety of reasons, it literally is just too complicated, or maybe they're not interested, or I mean, I don't know the behavior that you describe. If people leave the ballot blank, where are they trying to make a statement, or maybe they just give up? So, but that's an example of a trade-off, right? So you could list more information, you could use a slightly more complicated procedure on the one hand, and that might have the potential for more empowerment, more representation, but it also comes at the expense of more complication and perhaps a greater cognitive burden on voters themselves.
Sure, and
I don't know the answer to that question, which is the ideal one.
Right, and it's such a good point that certain reforms are going to be inherently easier to understand than others. Bonnie points out correctly that the Constitution was amended to provide for the direct election of US senators, and that's a fairly obvious reform to understand. It's a heck of a lot easier to wrap your mind around than something like ranked choice voting. Which I was surprised that we didn't get into, because ranked choice voting in the states is obviously something that citizens are debating, certainly in Maine. Ricky asks, and this doesn't bring voting systems per se into the dialogue, but the question is pertinent because the panel is about math and politics. Ricky asks, do you think it's a good practice to publish a poll result prior to election, assuming that people tend to flock towards a candidate that they believe to be ahead? And polls, one might argue, have become not an institution to select leaders, but part of the information that people use to make a decision about whichever candidate they might support. I was wondering if either of you have any comment on polls and their influence or lack of influence over election results, because I know that's something that's on a lot of people's minds.
Well, I'm not in the position to say whether it's a good or bad practice, but what I think we can do with the type of approach that we presented is to think about what it implies for the way voters make decisions. And you know, the examples we presented today are very simple examples. They're realistic because the groups do use these various rules. They're also very simplistic because in these settings, individuals are making decisions on their own without paying attention to what's going on in their environment. So it's a very, very simple environment. And when you have these polls, whether they're good or bad, they do provide information. And it might be in people's interests, especially if you think about an enhanced model, behavioral model, where you think about strategic behavior, whether perspective or reacting to the information. It might be in your interest to process that information and maybe revise a previous inclination to decide one way or the other. So what I think what they do, as a matter of fact, is that they complicate the problem. I think they probably do complicate the problem, but problems aside, they actually create a different environment, a different choice for people. Because it's not as if the election is happening at the same time and people are casting the ballots. It's a secret ballot, and this is sort of like a concurrent process, and then you get an outcome. You're learning information about the election, potentially informative signals that maybe would be in your interest to react to, maybe not. So it makes for a more complicated problem.
Sure, and I'm reminded on that point of the political scientist Sidney Verba's comment that participating in a sample survey or a poll can almost be an act of civic participation in the first place. And perhaps we should start thinking of it that way. It does, it changes the information environment in a fundamental way. I wonder if both of you could perhaps talk about, because it's fairly uncommon, I say this as a PhD candidate in political science, to see a course co-taught between a political science professor and a professor from mathematics. I wonder if you could speak in our remaining moments about some of the challenges and opportunities that sort of unique type of course has brought or helped facilitate.
Well, I have lots to say about this. So first of all, we're doing this because it's Themester, so we want to thank Themester again and say how interesting it is for us to do a class in math and politics as part of that. It's actually unusual for IU professors across departments to teach together, so we're actually pleased to be doing that as well. And it's coming from the side of mathematics. I want to say that math is usually motivated, if it's motivated as an applied or applicable subject, by its connections to science, especially physics, and engineering. Those are in a sense the classical ones, and now to computer science. So those are the ones that math is often motivated to. You should learn math to do those things. But I feel that math could be motivated by the social sciences as well. And when I was growing up, what really intrigued me was that a subject that's abstract and beautiful like math could help us with things in the social world, and things about language, especially for me, but also things about economic behavior and behavior of all kinds. Our psychology have a kind of math aspect, and so I feel that the challenge when I teach this is to try to do things like I was doing with the ice cream election, which is to find things that are simple enough that people can grab onto, and yet complicated enough to highlight the interesting features of something. So it's kind of a very interesting pedagogical approach. And our class now has people in it who are not math students. So these are people who never took any mathematics. And then the idea of using math as a kind of entry, the door to using politics as the door to enter into mathematical discussions is exciting for me.
Yeah, I would add that this is, in addition to the opportunity, is a fairly unique opportunity for people from different disciplines to come together and be able to teach a new class for undergraduates. I don't have the actual data, but I do know sort of my general impression is that this is a class that is rarely offered anywhere at the undergraduate level. So I think IU, it's not because we're teaching it, but I'm very grateful for the opportunity that IU is providing an education opportunity for our undergraduate students that doesn't really exist anywhere. Typically, I think so you might find some of these classes maybe in the mathematics department. So there are a few mathematicians who are interested in politics, and they teach this type of material, but it's just, I would say, is very few. So the fact that we're doing it, I think is very good. And of course, there are lots of opportunities, not just to interact, but to learn from one another, get insights from either discipline and find better answers, new answers to questions that are important not to us particularly, but to societies as well.
Sure, and the topic is just inherently interesting, and that's borne out in some of the really great questions that people have chimed in with. I want to make sure that we get to a few of them before we close too. Andrew Dabrowski asks, is the Condorcet paradox a real concern or just a story that political science professors use to scare children? I suppose someone should start by explaining the Condorcet paradox. I'm a little too tired to take it on myself.
So the answer to Andrew, I think, is both. You can use it for both purposes. But so for the benefit of everyone, the Condorcet paradox describes a situation where you have a group of people who can't figure out their mind. So you start with individuals who, just like the ranking you guys gave us for the different types of flavors of ice cream. It didn't happen this way, but there are some scenarios where you can have a lot of conflict, and you get this you get into these cycles where it's very hard to figure out which of the flavors should win. And so the manifestation of the paradox is you get these cyclical majorities. So at any point in time, you can find a majority that says butter pecan should be the national ice cream. And then you can get a second majority to say, which will also be a valid way to make a decision, who says otherwise. So you can go in cycles. So that's what the paradox is about. And it's a paradox because you start with individuals who know what they want. So as individuals, you have your rankings, and there's no uncertainty about that. But when you run an election, the output of the process is not going to be a clear answer. You're going to have these cyclical preferences. Andrew, an example which actually should be a fairly common occurrence, is whenever you talk about distributive politics, dividing a dollar, and if you use majority rule, it would be very easy to elicit the Condorcet paradox. So at any point in time, you can say you have 3 people, you can always get 2 people to agree on the particular division of the dollar, and you can find a new majority that would say, well, let's do it the other way. And people can switch sides from one majority to another. And unless you put an end to the cycle, you will go on and on forever.
So there is an element there that could potentially scare children, or at least scare people that care about democracy. There's something frustrating about hearing how much process matters here. And that's echoed in some questions that folks are asking as well. Victoria pushes back a little bit and just says, are there any voting systems that make an effort to combine different systems with different benefits? Not quite squaring the circle, I don't think Victoria is saying, but is it possible to devise a system that takes what's good about system A and what's good about system B and synthesizes them into something that's adequate or improved? Is it possible to not quite have it both ways, but can we leverage what's good about different voting systems?
Yeah, we can.
We can certainly try. I mean, we do see, I mean, think about the recent election. So you have two states, Maine in particular. So if they have this ranked choice process where it's sort of a combination. It's a hybrid of different methods. And you would argue, Victoria, in terms of benefits, that at least for some people in Maine, that this is a better system because it enhances representation. It also combines some of the winner takes all approach with proportional representation. But it's also a more complicated process. So what I would add, Victoria, is that yes, there might be combinations that improve on some margin, but there will be associated costs, which again goes back to the thing we were conveying here, that there'll be trade-offs to be made.
And understanding exactly what those trade-offs are and quantifying them, Dr. Moss, you suggested is really the job of mathematics here. That's the place where math can come in. Is that fair?
Yeah, in fact, there are people who do this stuff. They're actually, oftentimes they're philosophers, by the way, or computer scientists, not only mathematicians and political scientists. Yeah, it's a difficult question because you can to answer her question, combine different kind of voting systems. But since you can't do a perfect job, it's like, well, why are you actually doing this? It's a little bit, I mean, I don't know that anybody is proposing those systems to be used, but you can do it.
Now, we've been talking about elections a great deal, right? But there are other things that we do in our lives that are not political in nature. Could one of you or both, I'm sure this is likely covered in your class, discuss just a few examples of decisions that we might make in our day-to-day lives routinely that could benefit from the kind of logic that you've laid out?
Well, I have just to mention a few of the things that are taught in our class that are possibly pertinent. So one of them is the question of how do you divide things up in a fair way? So the kind of cover story for this is a couple getting divorced, and they have to divide up their house and their car and their paintings and time with their children and so on, and things that are not divisible. So you can't cut it in half the way you can cut a cake in half. So in fact, we actually have a unit on how do you divide things up fairly. And this is a procedure that actually is implemented in the real world. And we also think about how are decisions made, political decisions, but they're not voting things, like how do coalitions work? And this, I think, really goes back to one of the questions about minorities and power. So my takeaway from that whole discussion about coalitions is that if you have a very high bar to participate in a coalition, then the coalition is not going to be strong. So that is, it's not going to be a winning coalition. So I feel like there is things to be learned about winning coalitions from the things in our class that could actually be useful for, let's say, the example of underrepresented groups in political settings. So that's one thing that I think is a kind of takeaway, but it's not a clear takeaway. So, but maybe Armando has other things to say.
Well, I do. I want to show you something.
Oh.
So what you see on screen here is, do you guys see the rankings? So I took this from ESPN. These are the most recent rankings for college football Division I, and this is not a political public affairs decision. The rankings and voting underlie the whole process, and I thought this was interesting not just because of the high stakes. We're talking about billions of dollars, and but also this is also a ranking that invites questions about fairness. So from a mathematical perspective, so by the way, the way they do this, as I understand it, I don't participate in the voting. So they have a select number of voters, and these voters rank Division I programs. It's not entirely clear to me whether they rank all Division I programs, but they do vote, and they use these votes to rank the different teams. And they use the variation of the voter count that you saw today, but it's not exactly what they use. But a system like that, you might satisfy some properties of fairness, but it also raises, you might have questions about why a team, I'm just going to pick one here, number 4, a team that has a loss, so 7-1, will be ranked higher than the team that hasn't been defeated. By the way, we do have this, there's a mathematical property that will capture this kind of outcome is, so one of the questions we could ask about a voting system is whether it satisfies the Condorcet winner criterion, which requires that certainly the very top team, but this is sort of the general logic, is that you should have, the highest rankings should go to the teams that will beat everyone else. And here you actually can find examples of teams that might have been defeated by other teams, and so it doesn't respect this property. So this is just an example where you can certainly apply this in other settings. And there's certainly one that captures a lot of attention. By the way, you can see Indiana is ranked number 10. But it has lots of stakes, especially in terms of the economics. And also he gets to play in the playoffs. So it does matter. The ranking matters for a variety of reasons, but especially, you want to be in the top 4 because, you get to play in one of the, participate in the playoffs. So the ranking is not trivial.
So the takeaway is that there are lots of non-political settings where the kinds of things that you're teaching in your Themester course are equally important. We have time for one more question, and I suppose I'll just pose it. You have discussed your course, which sounds wonderful. It's the kind of class that I would have loved to have taken as an undergraduate. What is, we have finished, well, hopefully finished living through a pretty dramatic election season. What was the day after the election last week? Maybe each of you could answer this question separately. What was the one piece of advice for processing the election results that you were most eager to share with the students in your course? And I'll put that to both professors, and then we can close it.
Well, it's a tough question to answer because students are going to process the results in different ways, right? And this is going to be conditioned by their political preferences, how they perceive the outcome and the process itself. So, I myself would be disinclined to give any advice about it. It's an evolving process, right? So we still have, what we do see in elections, this is a more general statement, I think that shouldn't be controversial, is that we have, in the exercise or implementation of any voting mechanism, you have both formal and informal rules. So we have the Constitution prescribes a formal process. What we observed a few weeks ago was just the first step of the process, right? So officially, the voters who select the president are the electors, the Electoral College, and the Constitution prescribes a time for when they shall meet and sort of make that decision. So that's sort of the formal institutional aspect. And then you have the informal one about whether people we might be able to project an answer beforehand. And as you know, it's a very controversial one, so I don't think it would be appropriate for me to give an opinion about it.
Yeah, there strikes me as something just so important at helping students understand how much process matters and to always keep that broader picture in mind. Dr. Moss, same question to you before we close.
Okay, sure. What really strikes me is because I'm teaching this class and also a voter and interested, is how discontinuous the process is when you only have like a winner-take-all election. So when you have winner-take-all, so mathematics things are continuous. There's like a smooth change, and when you have a situation where you're voting and there's going to be one winner and one loser, and then it's very discontinuous because they're standing for different things. You really wonder, shouldn't there be a way to make decisions in a society that's a little bit smoother, that maybe the emotions wouldn't be so high if things were changing in a more gradual way. And it's not that I disagree with the change. I mean, I have an opinion, and my opinion is not relevant. It's what's relevant to this question is, is the structure of the way we're making decisions in a society the best one? And we don't even ask that question ever. So I think thinking about that and asking this kind of question is what I would like people to do the most.
Well, I know that as this conversation closes out, I feel more empowered and equipped to think about the institutions that we use to elect leaders in American society. And I'm sure that I speak for everybody in attendance as well. Thank you. And I'll turn it back to Vanessa.
Great.
Thank you.
So much. Thank you so much, Eric. Thank you again for joining us and participating in this evening's live streaming event. I would like to thank Professor Moss, Professor Razo, and Mr. Schmidt for their time and expertise. We are grateful to you all. Finally, I should acknowledge that events like this would not be possible without the support of donors who understand the value of a liberal arts education. If you would like to support the faculty, students, and programs of the College of Arts and Sciences, please consider making a contribution to the Arts and Sciences Priority Fund at the Indiana University Foundation. Until next time, please take care and stay safe.